Welcome back, and I am now seriously concerned that this class may last longer than the Vietnam War. A reminder, which I forgot to say at the front of the class, week 8 is the exam. This is week 6, I believe. So it's coming up soon. Check the discussion list and the web page. I will send out an email within the next 48 hours with a list of study questions on it. The categories we'll cover are the early period in Vietnamese history, nationalism and resistance from, like the 1st century BC up to the French period. Another area will be the French period, Vietnamese resistance and so forth. Ho Chi Minh, nationalism and communism will be one. Origins of the U.S. commitment to Vietnam, why and how the U.S. got involved after World War II up to 1960. Probably something on Kennedy in Vietnam, probably something on this stuff, on the Americanization of the war. Read Masters of War, we will cover that within the next week or so. And there may be a question on that as well. Now, next week will be week 7, and the stuff we do next week may be on the test, but obviously week 8 you're not going to. So make sure next week that you watch this as soon as you can. If you tape it, on Friday night, there's a test just 4 days after that, Friday night, Saturday morning, I should say. So next week's class, make sure you get to it, as soon as you can if you're watching it at home. We'll send you, as I said, via email to those of you on the list, and if you're not, please do that. I'll post the questions on that. I'll put them on the web page. Just go to the Vietnam page, and I'll create a new link for review questions. We'll have probably 7 or 8 practice questions on that, all based on stuff we've done in here and based on the readings. The better answers will integrate the stuff we've done here in class and stuff you've read from the reader, from Dwiker, from Marilyn Young's book, perhaps from my book specifically, depending on how far we get. So make sure you do all the readings and you integrate readings and class stuff together. If you're watching this and you're not on the web, you can't see the web page, or you don't have, you're not on the email, but you need a study sheet, give me a call. I guess 743-3093, and we'll figure something out. But by all means, do get a hold of the test. The exam, for those of you at home, will occur here on campus that Wednesday, week 8, 7 o'clock at night. And I still have to get a room, which I will notify you of via all those sources, email and web page. All right, and if you want to come and take it here during class time, you're more than welcome to if you're doing it at home. So that the questions will get out to you ASAP. The room I will get out to you as soon as possible too. That may take a bit longer because that's not under my control. So that information will get to you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me or James, who I don't think you can see right now, the person who's actually going to grade most of the stuff. And both our email addresses and names and phone numbers are on the syllabus, so feel free to contact either one of us with any questions or concerns you have. Okay. So having said that, let's keep going and talk about the Johnson approach to Vietnam. Not only does Johnson stay the course, but he actually begins to raise the stakes on Vietnam. There is a movement by late 1963, early 1964, within the U.S. policymaking circles to do something sooner rather than later, because as McNamara had pointed out, within 2-3 months, the stuff's going to hit the fan and we'll be up the creek, to mix a bunch of metaphors. So beginning late 63 and into 64, you start to see recognition that there's a real crisis on hand in Vietnam. Maxwell Taylor, who is now the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, points out that the U.S. has made a commitment to Vietnam and really needs to follow through on this. Taylor suggests, in fact, that the U.S. assume, hopefully temporary, control over the ARVN to really kind of get control of Vietnam, because Vietnam, the Vietnamese, the Southerners by themselves, the ARVN and the government in the South aren't doing it. They're not up to the task. This is Taylor's advice. We take control over the ARVN. We start cracking the whip on them. We put pressure on them to stop infiltration, to fight more, to conduct air strikes against the North. And perhaps, Taylor says, we should even commit U.S. forces quote, as necessary in direct actions against North Vietnam. Taylor, as you'll see in Masters of War's all over the place. At one point, you know, he's kind of bellicose and ready to fight, and another time he points out how futile and pointless it all is. So he's kind of all over the place. But in late 63, he's kind of taken a hard line. McNamara does the same thing. McNamara, Taylor, everybody really is aware of what the situation is like in Vietnam, but they tend to ignore their own warnings, their own appraisals. McNamara, after he returns in December, issues a report. That report essentially becomes National Security Action Memoranda 288. So NESAM 288 is basically McNamara's doing, and it's kind of a combination of what he saw in Vietnam and what Taylor and the Joint Chiefs of Staff suggested. Not quite as much. In NSAM 288, McNamara recommends against military action against North Vietnam. He thinks that would be provocative and probably not terribly useful, but otherwise accepts a fairly hardline interpretation that the U.S. really has to crack down on South Vietnam and take a more direct role, or the war will be lost sooner rather than later. And this also kind of, in NSAM 288, you also see old Cold War rhetoric, the domino theory. Unless the U.S. can preserve South Vietnam, NSAM 288 says almost all of Southeast Asia will fall under communist domination. So basically they're reinvoking the domino theory. Walt Rostow says the United States has to draw the line in the dust at the borders of South Vietnam. It should move additional forces to block infiltration and threaten Ho Chi Minh with American retaliation. So Rostow is suggesting taking the war to the north, and this, as I've said before, this is the debate, you know, as to where the war really is. You know, it strikes me I could get Xerox copies of maps made, so this wouldn't be such an embarrassment. But there are those who will argue that the United States essentially has to take the war to Hanoi, and you're going to have others who continue to say, no, the insurgency is here in the South, and this is what we have to do. All right. But in 63, you start to see this movement, Taylor, Rostow, and others saying, well, maybe we should go take the war to the north to force Ho Chi Minh to end the insurgency in the South. This assumes that Ho can be forced to end the insurgency, and also assumes that Ho can tell the insurgency what to do, and the insurgency is going to listen. And I would contend at this point that there's still a fair degree, a large degree of autonomy in the NLF, and they're not going to, if Ho tells them to lay down their arms, they're not going to do it. All right? So these are the American suggestions at the time, and this is essentially what NSAM 288 suggests. On the heels of this, in early 64, McNamara and Taylor take a trip to Vietnam. And the reason I'm talking about these things, which by themselves, you know, are similar to other stuff that's going on, is just to show, you know, kind of how aware the Americans are. I think that's important to understand that this, you know, the terms sometimes used to describe Vietnam are things like a morass or a quagmire or a tragedy and things like that. But in fact, you know, I think it's very important to understand that everybody was pretty clear on what was going on there. There was good information. It wasn't bad information. It wasn't terribly optimistic. It wasn't naive. There was a real sense of the problem there and the depth of it. For example, McNamara and Taylor in March of 64 go to Vietnam and return home and report that conditions, quote, unquestionably have been growing worse. All right? There are 43 or 44, there are 43 provinces in the South. McNamara and Taylor report that the Viet Cong have dominant influence in over half of the southern provinces. Now, for the U.S. to admit this is quite serious. I mean, the VC's numbers are higher. They would suggest influence in well over 50%, perhaps 2/3. The U.S. concedes 50%. All right? They point out, and this is going to be a problem throughout the war, that desertion rates in the ARVN, in the Southern Army, are quite high. Draft evasion was soaring. This is a draftee army, the ARVN. Many of them, I mean, they're farmers. They're younger men. Some have families. They're drafted into a war to fight, as they perceive it, for a regime which may not be in their best interests. They may even be followers of the NLF, or members of their family could be. So it's not at all unusual to see someone in the Arvin lay down arms and head back to his home village to take up farming again, or to be there for the harvest season, or to visit a family, a wife, a child, or whatever. Draft evasion was a constant problem throughout the entire war. It was real easy for young Vietnamese men to evade the draft. You don't have a computerized selective service system. This is not an advanced technological society. So, you don't carry around like we, everybody knows where we are through ATM records and internet records and phone records. I mean, they could piece together your life, very easily. You can't do that in Vietnam. So evading the draft isn't terribly difficult to do, since there's no centralized authority or anything like that. So desertion rates and draft evasion has soared while, this is McNamara and Taylor reporting, the enemy is recruiting energetically and effectively. Between the middle of 1963 and early 1964, the NLF essentially wipes out the Strategic Hamlets program. It's basically dead on arrival by 64. It was created in late 62, and it was a dismal failure. Meanwhile, the political chaos, the fallout from the coup, continues. And in fact, between November and March, this is not even 6 months, 35 province chiefs had been replaced. 35 out of 43 province chiefs have been replaced since the coup. Imagine if, what's that, 3/4? Imagine if 75 senators were suddenly replaced, in Washington, D.C. within a 5 or 6 month period. It's a fairly significant turnaround. And so this clearly indicates some pretty high level of instability. So this is the McNamara-Taylor report. It's pretty bleak. No one can say we didn't see this coming. And in fact, LBJ himself recognizes how bad things are. He's discussing the war with William Fulbright, J. William Fulbright, who I'll mention shortly. I'll show a photo of Fulbright. Fulbright is the chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, one of the most influential, powerful senators in the United States. Fulbright, you've probably all heard of Fulbright fellowships. Those come from the Fulbright family, the Fulbright Foundation. In fact, Kennedy had considered naming Fulbright Secretary of State in 1961 when he became president, decided not to. Fulbright's a very powerful senator. Fulbright's an old Cold Warrior, and at this point, 63, 64, he's a supporter of the war in Vietnam, and so he and Johnson get together and they're discussing this on the phone. And Johnson says, the only thing I know how to do is more of the same and to do it effectively. LBJ is kind of agonizing with Fulbright and says, I can't withdraw, I can't neutralize, I can't send in combat troops that might be bogged down in a long war against the North Vietnamese or the Chinese. So what can I do? Basically keep doing more of the same. So LBJ realizes how bad the situation is too. All right? So on the heels of the McNamara-Taylor report, there's a real sense that the situation in Vietnam is quite bad. Making matters worse, the U.S. military doesn't have a very optimistic view of things either. Military caution, military dissent, military resistance, whatever you want to call it, is a constant throughout the war. And you see this in 1964 too. Before these major fateful decisions for intervention are made, the military is not really on board to any significant degree. General Douglas MacArthur, 1964. He's on his deathbed. He will die later that year. And LBJ, William Westmoreland, who's the commander in Vietnam, name mentioned shortly, goes to visit MacArthur right after he's named the new commander in Vietnam. And LBJ visits MacArthur shortly before he dies. I believe he was in his townhouse apartment in New York, or possibly even in a clinic in the hospital there. But to both Westmoreland and Johnson, MacArthur, famous military man, warns about Vietnam. He tells Westmoreland, don't overlook the possibility that in order to defeat the guerrilla, you may have to resort to a scorched earth policy. People's war, scorched earth, that doesn't make sense. There's a kind of a somewhat poignant or anecdote, and who knows if this is true or not, because LBJ obviously had a propensity to embellish stories, but he apparently met with MacArthur shortly before MacArthur died, and on his way out, MacArthur calls him back and in a very weak voice grabs his hand and says, "Remember Lyndon, no ground troops in Asia," or something to that effect. And among military people, this was not uncommon, and it wouldn't surprise me actually if MacArthur did say that, having understood what the Philippine War was like in World War II, guerrilla war and insurgent warfare. So uniformed officials then, military people, are not optimistic. They recognize that this type of strategy that first Paul Harkins and then William Westmoreland developed, conventional firepower, isn't working. And in fact, there's a changeover too in the American military command at this point. Paul Harkins was scheduled to retire in mid-1964, and so the U.S. has to find a replacement for him, and they come up with William Westmoreland. And this is interesting. The choice of Westmoreland really says a lot about the way Washington viewed the war. Westmoreland was not, I don't want to say he wasn't a popular choice, but by no means was he an easy choice as far as the military was concerned. Many military people wanted a different kind of officer brought in. Westmoreland was a traditional officer, a veteran of the 101st Airborne, and a lot of military folk and other people, including some on the White House staff, wanted somebody who was trained in counterinsurgency in Vietnam. Specifically, there was a man named General William Yarborough, who was the head of Special Forces at Fort Bragg, and there were people who were pressing for Yarborough to be named as Harkin's replacement to really give a sense that counterinsurgency, anti-guerrilla warfare, pacification would be very important. Instead, Johnson chooses Westmoreland. William Yarborough, after Westmoreland is appointed, Yarborough, the guy who people like, I believe, Roger Hilsman and Mike Forrestal from the White House staff wanted appointed, including many military wanted appointed as a replacement. Yarborough writes to Westmoreland, "I cannot emphasize too greatly that the entire conflict in Southeast Asia is 80% in the realm of ideas and only 20% in the field of physical conflict." This is Yarborough's take on the war. This is a political, ideological war, a war of values, a war of culture, a war of ideas. Only 20% is in the field of physical conflict. We can win, we have better firepower, we can kill them off, but it won't really matter. That's only 20% of the battle. All right? Yarborough continues, so long as the NLF continues to believe in the virtue of its cause, quote, "there will be no peace." So long as their morale remains high, we can't stop them. Repeated terrorist acts even would not cause military defeat. But a war can be lost mentally and morally through these means. The U.S. has to be careful not to resort to this type of scorched earth policy that MacArthur warned about. This is Yarborough. Yarborough says this is a danger to be guarded against at all costs. And you see this time and again. It's interesting, one thing I came across when I was doing some research on this is there was a group in the JCS called the Joint War Games Agency, and they established war games. They would create teams with high-ranking officials on it, and they would put together a scenario like Vietnam, and they would figure out how it turned out. And these war games are really fascinating because every time they got together, the conclusions were terribly bleak, and these included big-timers. I mean, Maxwell Taylor participated, Earl Wheeler, who was the Army Chief of Staff and later Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff Bruce Palmer, one of Westmoreland's deputies, John McCone from the CIA, McGeorge and William Bundy, Michael Forrestal, George Ball from the State Department, Chester Cooper from the State Department, people like that. Truly the cream of the crop, the people who are making decisions. This is not a theoretical thing. These are actual policymakers. And whenever they get together for these war games, it's incredible what they find out. I mean, in a war game in April of '64, the basic conclusion from the participants, White House and military, was that Hanoi does not control the VC. This is the American military and civilian establishment saying that. They're conceding. This is not a puppet of Hanoi. The Viet Cong are essentially on their own. They believe that the North's influence is mainly psychological and disciplinary, not material. All right? They're emotive, they're kind of Kiem Dao indoctrination, but other than that, they're not giving orders and they're not supplying them to any great degree. They said there's little evidence, even if we bomb the North, to suggest that they will capitulate. On the other hand, a small expenditure of iron bombs involves the potential commitment of major U.S. forces representing millions of dollars if the North doesn't fold. So if we try to do something and it doesn't work, then we're in deeper and deeper and deeper. And on it goes like that. All right? So they understand that politically the NLF is popular. These people in this war game, Maxwell Taylor and the Bundys and so forth, say Johnson can expect obvious difficulties engaging the extent of communist involvement in, quote, honest revolutionary movements against despotic regimes. So what they're saying is LBJ is going to have a hard time trying to say that this is communist subversion when, in fact, this will be sold and bought in large measure as an honest revolutionary movement, the NLF, against a despotic regime, the RVN. And reports out of Vietnam are just as bleak. Viet Cong activity in mid-1964 was at high intensity, especially in the area around Saigon and in the Central Highlands, which is the area known as Two Corps. The Central Highlands is, this area here. All right. So in this area, in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, in this map, was always a VC stronghold. The Viet Cong was using anti-aircraft fire effectively to shoot down American planes. It was a great story there. No one, I don't want to say no one, but I've never seen terribly reliable statistics on just how many American planes, how much money was lost in the air war. I mean, they talk a great deal about unleashing the Air Force, but in fact, the Viet Cong had a very capable anti-aircraft arsenal and used it quite effectively, both in the RVN and over northern Vietnam. Reports coming out of Vietnam from the military suggest that the insurgents, the NLF, was conducting sabotage, harassment, assassinations of local officials, small-scale combat, and so forth. What's the point of all this? By continuing to successfully fight a guerrilla war, that indicates that at the most fundamental level, the village level, the Americans and the ARVN are not capable of providing security. Because in local, small-level engagements, the VC maintained the initiative. Right? By early June of 1964, the Viet Cong actually conduct fewer operations but increase the size of the attacks, and they begin to use their main force units in larger engagements. So in '64, the VC feel confident enough now not only to do guerrilla-type ambushes and attacks and mortars and assassinations, but now to actually engage the ARVN. This is a guerrilla main force unit against a conventional army, and they're doing well, they're winning, right? Which indicates a real problem then. Right? So then the enemy has some obvious strengths, as the military and others point out. At the same time, the ally, the RVN, has some real problems, and this is nothing new. After the coup, from the period after the coup, as I said, there was incredible chaos, and this continues. So the ally has, the enemy is strong, the ally is ailing. And here's a couple examples. I have a couple photos there which kind of indicate, and I'll mention this in a minute. This is Nguyen Khan right here, and he's facing a group, as you can tell, a very sizable group of student protesters. And almost immediately after Nguyen Khan, who's put in power on January 30th, remember this is a Pentagon coup, Nguyen Khan immediately faces popular protests and demonstrations, especially from university students and from Buddhists. That situation hasn't been settled. And throughout the spring and summer of 1964, the Buddhists are in the streets. And this is a photo of Buddhists. You can see the bonzes with their robes on being tear gassed by government forces. All right? So throughout 1964, then, you have popular demonstrations continuing at a high pitch. And the United States has to recognize this. McNamara, in fact, at a mid-May '64 meeting, says not only is the Viet Cong's influence rising, the new Con government, Nguyen Con, this is the government the U.S. put in. This is bought and sold for, bought and paid for by the U.S. The Con government, this is McNamara, quote, is fragmented and a religious crisis with the Buddhists is brewing. So this makes military action even more difficult. Never, ever lose sight in Vietnam of the correlation, the convergence of military and political factors. How can you fight a war, a people's war, a counterinsurgent war, when the government you're there, the country you've created and are there to protect, doesn't have popular backing and in fact is under attack from its own people. All right? Again, let's take a look at these photos. I mean, they're symbolic, right? Is this the front? Is this the VC? No, these are university students, the sons and daughters of the elite, mostly the sons of the elite, facing down Win Con. These are Buddhists. Buddhists aren't communists and socialists, and in fact, they're going to have a lot of problems with the communists. All right? They're the ones who are in the streets protesting. So how can the United States save a government or a country that has its own people attacking it? Right? I mean, to suggest somehow that the Viet Cong have come in and undermined the society is just not right, because these are internal attacks. In addition to that, these coups, they're not staged by the coups aren't Viet Cong inspired coups, they're army coups. This is the government tearing itself apart. It's cannibalism. So always keep that in mind. The political situation in the South is so inchoate, incoherent and chaotic for so long that the enemy really doesn't have to wage much of a war to gain success. Politically, there's no contest, and the United States is imposing itself in a war that politically it really cannot win, because the people it's supporting do not have not been able to develop political stability and don't really have a popular backing there. So the United States doesn't have a whole lot of options. It can do what it does, which is essentially try to kill off the enemy and buy time and hope something happens. I mean, this old mantra about reform comes back and bites them. They've been talking for so long about reform, never took it seriously, essentially gave the Vietnamese leverage. You know, they knew that Diem wasn't going to reform, and Diem knew the U.S. wasn't going to pull the rug out. Well, they're essentially now victims of their own creation, and the RVN has the power now in this relationship. The U.S. basically is forcing Vietnamese leaders to stay in this thing. They're negotiating governments of reconciliation. They're making overtures to the NLF, and it's the Americans who are afraid peace is going to break out. And they're putting pressure. I mean, they facilitate the overthrow, first of Diem to a small extent, and then to a huge extent, Duong Van Minh, Big Min. Why? Ostensibly because they were talking peace with the NLF, and the U.S. did not want to see that. American credibility could not tolerate a neutralized Vietnam, because a neutral Vietnam almost inevitably and probably soon becomes Ho Chi Minh's communist Vietnam. All right? So then the Americans really can't do much. Maxwell Taylor says if we attack North Vietnam, that will provoke a strong reaction by the Viet Cong in the South. Taylor understands these are different things. They're not the same. Right? And the communists can increase their activities in the South to any level commensurate with the Americans' initiative. So the communists can match us. Right? Maxwell Taylor concludes one of his, it's Lyndon Johnson concludes one of his briefings on Vietnam by saying, even with increased American aid, the prospects in South Vietnam are not bright. Right? This is fairly bleak and telling. In Vietnam, the situation, as Johnson says, is tenuous. No, Westmoreland says, I'm sorry. Tenuous but not hopeless. This is the best he can come up with. It's not hopeless. The Buddhists and the Catholics within the ARVN are fighting. So you have essentially a civil war within the Southern military, often based on religious differences, because how is one in the Diem regime more likely promoted? By being Catholic. So Catholics tend to have influential positions in the ARVN. And so the Buddhists, this is Westmoreland, the head of the American military, saying, the political situation in the South, quote, resembles the most absurd opera bouffe, with the Buddhist Catholic tensions and infighting among junta members making it impossible to achieve stability. This is Westmoreland's evaluation of the Allies' ills. So you have, nothing that's terribly promising in a situation like that. So then by mid-1964, the U.S. military is very cautious based on its objective analysis of the enemy's strengths and the Allies' problems. All right? So 64 is a real critical time. I mean, I think LBJ basically is hemmed in anyway. I mean, I think once he becomes president, he really can't reverse course. Like I said, I'm not sure once the U.S. Approved of the French return in 45, 46, it really could have done much different than what it did in Vietnam. You know, I don't know about this turning point or last chance for peace and all that. I think sometimes we hype that up. But I think, you know, once LBJ comes in, he's not going to do anything different. Perhaps Kennedy could have, I don't know. But LBJ really can't. So 64 then, I mean, it's critical, not in the sense that a decision is going to be made, because I think it's already been made, but it's critical in the sense of how the Americans are going to go about doing what they've committed themselves to do. The U.S. is committed now to preserving some kind of anti-communist government below the 17th parallel. All right, this is the U.S. job now. It has to keep this free. It has to keep this allied with the United States. It cannot allow this area of Vietnam below the 17th parallel to become communist or neutral or whatever. All right, so, but it's from 64 on then, this decision I think is already, that's in the can. 64 on becomes important. How are we going to do it? Are we going to take over? Are we going to let the Vietnamese do it? Are we going to give them air power? Are we going to give them support? Are we going to send troops in to fight? And so from 64 to 65, in a fairly short period, you have major decisions made. And that's transformative. That's transformative. There's a real transformation there. You know, you've already made the decision to save, but you've gone from a somewhat limited role in, let's say, mid-64 to an American war in early 65. So you've gone from a position where American advisors and American firepower, American technology is involved to American soldiers actually fighting. And this occurs fairly quickly. So this is the transformation there. So Lyndon Johnson then has to face up to this. But at the same time, there are all kinds of political factors going on at home that he has to deal with. Johnson receives these reports from Taylor, from McNamara, from people in the field. He reads about it in the New York Times. David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, as I pointed out, are getting fed information by John Paul Vann and other advisors talking about how the situation is pretty bad in Vietnam. So Johnson's aware of what's going on there, and he's not terribly thrilled about it. But Johnson also believes he's hemmed in by American politics, and he tends to embellish his own role in all this too. He sees that the reports in the field are bad. The New York Times is saying very bleak things. Even people who are urging escalation do not guarantee any level of success whatsoever. But he says he doesn't have a choice, because political factors are overriding, and Johnson always invokes Harry Truman in China in 1949, which we talked about in the first or second week. Remember how the Democratic Party and Truman were blamed for the loss of China, as if they owned China at some point. So it was the Democrats are weak. They were riddled by communists, and Joe McCarthy goes after him, and Nixon goes after him, and so on. And LBJ and the Democrats were always running scared at that point, which is, of course, a great irony, because the Democrats have never been afraid to fight. They've been an interventionist party throughout the entire 20th century. They were never soft on communism. The classic Cold Warriors of the day were people like Dean Acheson and John Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey and Scoop Jackson, who are all Democrats. I mean, this was never a party that was soft on communism. Truman instituted loyalty oaths. The Kennedys supported McCarthy. In fact, when McCarthy was finally brought down, it was Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith who nailed him on the Senate floor with a very powerful and impassioned speech. The Democrats were never soft on communism. The Democrats were always followers of fashion, the prevailing fashion, and you know, went along with red baiting just as much as anybody else did. But Johnson nonetheless is afraid of this. He says, in fact, if the United States loses in Vietnam, quote, if the United States loses in Vietnam and lets Ho Chi Minh run through the streets of Saigon, Johnson says, the United States will be rewarding aggression just as the West had done with Hitler in the 1930s. Ho suddenly becomes Hitler, a guy, you know, Hitler who controls the most powerful country in Central Europe, which is the most crucial area in the world, is compared to, you know, this small 5'2" leader who controls an area that's vastly underdeveloped and of no strategic significance at all. So all of a sudden, Ho Chi Minh is elevated to this level, and they would constantly compare him to Hitler. And it was foolish because the world didn't buy it. I mean, people in the United States didn't really buy it for the most part. And, you know, internationally, just people weren't making that, you know, connection. This is not Hitler. All right, and so LBJ, you know, but he's doing this to kind of say, look, I'm hemmed in. If I let Ho win, I'll be no better than Neville Chamberlain. You know, they'll mock me like they mock Chamberlain. Instead of carrying umbrellas, they'll wear Stetsons or something like that. Then he goes on, a communist victory in Vietnam, quote, will cause an endless national debate, a mean and destructive debate that will shatter my presidency, kill my administration, and damage our democracy. I think the order there is funny. You know, it'll kill my presidency, shatter my, and it'll hurt our democracy too, by the way. My favorite part, though, is just as Mao's victory in China had undermined Truman, Johnson is afraid that a loss in Vietnam would do the same thing to him. In fact, LBJ says, Harry Truman's problems in China, quote, are chicken shit compared to what would happen to me if we lost Vietnam. So the loss of China, which is the most populous country in the world and the key to Asia, is analogous now to defeat in Vietnam. Okay? Truman's problems are chicken shit compared to what will happen to me if we lose Vietnam. Right? And you know, this is part of his worldview. You know, I can't do it. This will be a mean, destructive debate. The country will erupt. It'll be worse than McCarthyism. Right? So, if
that does sound like something somebody from Texas would say.
Oh, LBJ is as you know, probably better than me, if any of you are native Texans. Very, very colorful. Very colorful. I guess this is a good segue, right? Johnson, well, in a sense, it's useful. This isn't just for shock value. Johnson kind of personalizes things. And it's very hard. I mean, you know, he's the president of this incredible superpower. I mean, you know, never has there been a country with the military and material resources that the U.S. has in the 1960s. After World War II, the U.S. controlled 50% of the world's trade, and in the early 60s, it still controls 25% of the world's trade. The U.S. has about 6% of the population and uses about a third of the resources. Militarily, it has a stockpile of nuclear weapons and a vast military arsenal. Johnson is the leader of this country, and he has an ego to match it, so he personalizes it. He doesn't understand how this ragtag band of peasants who are fighting with guns stolen from the United States, who don't have an Air Force, can match up to the U.S., and especially how this little short guy who, you know, this ascetic, funny beard, can match up to the United States, right? And so he personalizes it quite deeply, and in fact, as we'll see, you know, it can become quite colorful, you know, seeing this as part of his manliness and as part of his own stature as an American, as a Texan, probably too. All right, so Johnson then is afraid of being attacked as being weak on communism. At the same time, in 1964, Johnson has to face the issue of re-election, and this also will come into play. So on one hand, LBJ says, I can't lose in Vietnam because they'll kill me, just like they got a hold of Truman. All right. It'll be even worse. But at the same time, he's running for president, and LBJ is the peace candidate. 1964, the economy's going swell. Liberalism is riding high. At home, we'll talk about this in the coming weeks, LBJ is trying to develop a great society. Martin Luther King has successfully pressured the country, attacked its moral integrity. In Birmingham, in Selma, and places like that, to help push through legislation on civil rights and voting rights laws. So this is a great time for the Americans, and LBJ doesn't want to ruin all that with a war. So he's running for re-election, for election in his own right in 1964, and he's going to run as the peace candidate and kind of invert these photos. He's running against the Republican named Barry Goldwater, who at the time was the darling of the right wing of the Republican Party, in many ways the founder of today's hard-right Republican Party, the intellectual, if you want to use that term, heir to people like Ronald Reagan, and today's far right. I mean, people like Pat Buchanan and Gary Bauer and Alan Keyes see Goldwater as something of a patron saint. Of course, if any of you follow Goldwater in his later years, he actually married a woman who was, I don't know if there's anything to do with it, but apparently she had a lot of influence on him. She was younger than him and very progressive, and he became quite outspoken in things in favor of things like abortion rights and gay rights and anti-militarism. So the Republicans kind of distanced themselves and said, oh, poor Barry, he has Alzheimer's and stuff like that. But in 1964, you know, Goldwater was very hardline conservative. I'll mention that again. So LBJ is running against Goldwater, and LBJ is going to be the peace candidate. And in fact, when it comes to Vietnam, the differences between the two candidates are clear cut. Goldwater basically wants to take the war to Vietnam and, blow them off the map, blow them back to the Stone Age. That's kind of the caricature of it. But Goldwater's quite strident. You know, in Vietnam, he will use American military force to end this thing and get it over with as soon as he can. Johnson runs as the peace candidate and basically says, you can't trust Goldwater. He's a nut. I'm not going to send American boys to Vietnam to fight in a war that Asian boys ought to be fighting in. And Johnson has, I still think, the most powerful political commercial I've ever seen. And if you've ever seen it, and it ran once. It's a photo of a young girl picking daisies, counting to 10. Picking the petals off of a flower. 1, 2, 3, and all of a sudden it flashes, and you hear a countdown: 10, 9, 8, and you see a mushroom cloud go up. And LBJ's voiceover says, the decision is now. We can either live together in peace or we can all die. And it's just incredibly powerful. And so they paint Goldwater as a nut, as an extremist. Goldwater, the conservative, Goldwater's motto was, "In your heart, you know he's right," and Johnson turned it, in your gut, in your guts, he's nuts. He's this, and this is Johnson's pitch. If you elect this guy, he's going to be at war in Vietnam. He's going to do this and that, and he's a madman. You can't trust him. So Johnson runs as the peace candidate in Vietnam. All right, in 1964. So on one hand, he's afraid of being red-baited if he loses Vietnam, but publicly he understands that there's no real overriding, and this is where, on some level you understand why LBJ thinks this way, but it's harder to have sympathy for him when he plays both sides, which is why sometimes you read articles about some of the tapes that come out. LBJ expresses misgivings in a conversation with X, Y, or Z on these new tapes that are constantly being opened up to the public, declassified at the LBJ library. Johnson will say anything to anybody at any time. So on one hand, Truman's problems were nothing compared to mine. It'll kill me if the Vietnamese win this war. And on the other hand, he tells the American people, we're not going to fight. I guarantee you, we're not going to fight in Vietnam. I mean, Woodrow Wilson said that in 1916. Franklin Roosevelt said that in 1940. And what did both of them do the next year? Okay? LBJ does the same thing. All three are Democrats, the party that's soft on communism, right? So this is LBJ's trying to have it both ways. I can't lose Vietnam because they'll kill me. On the other hand, I won't send American boys to fight in Vietnam. So he's going both ways. At the same time, the situation in Vietnam is changing too. American policy is essentially stagnant. Earl Wheeler, who is the Army Chief of Staff later, soon in 1964 to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says the political situation in South Vietnam has steadily gotten worse. The government has gotten weaker. A clear recognition of the problems the U.S. has. So it's time for a change, it seems, and a new group is brought in. And the keys to this, the key people in this, as I said before, were William Westmoreland and Earl Wheeler. Here's a picture of Westmoreland here, and in addition to that, this is kind of like the American team in Vietnam. This is Westmoreland, the military commander, and this is also a photo of Walt Rostow, Dean Rusk, and William Bundy. And these are three hawks. All right, these are military hawks, along with George Bundy and McNamara. They are the real core of the policymaking group, and they are five hawks. They are responsible for Vietnam far more than anybody in military uniform is, far more than Westmoreland is, who's essentially taking orders. So this is the American team in Vietnam. And the key players there militarily on the ground are William Westmoreland and Earl Wheeler. And I just briefly want to mention this because this says a lot about the way the Americans are perceiving the war in Vietnam. As I mentioned before, when Westmoreland was appointed, there were a lot of people within the military who were upset or disappointed, at least, by that, because they thought somebody with a background in counterinsurgency, pacification, people's war, guerrilla warfare, whatever, should have been appointed. Westmoreland had become kind of a favorite of JFK. I don't remember the circumstances they met at West Point. I believe Westmoreland was commandant of West Point around 1960 or 61 and met Kennedy then, and Kennedy took a liking to him, and so they converged at that point. And so Westmoreland moves through the ranks. Westmoreland, as I said, was in the 101st Airborne, but really was more of a bureaucrat or a manager than an old military hand. He had gone to, for a short time, I think he may have actually gotten an MBA at the Harvard School of Management. One of the founders of the Harvard School of Management was Robert Strange McNamara. So again, there's that connection. Westmoreland does not have any background really at all to speak of in counterinsurgency warfare. He is conventionally trained based on the Army concept. A lot of the military people are upset and quite angry. The level of anger and disappointment, you know, you can't gauge, but clearly there are movements against Westmoreland when he's nominated. Westmoreland's nickname was the Inevitable General because people kind of thought, you know, he was very slick politically. He had very little, if any, background in counterinsurgency. He was very image conscious. People used to joke that he always found a way to get in front of the mic or in front of the photographer, and he was very aloof. He was not the Joint Chiefs of Staff choice to command MACV in Vietnam. I suspect if the military had been allowed to vote on it, somebody like Yarborough from Fort Bragg, a specialist in counterinsurgency, remember, who said 80% of it is in the realm of ideas and only 20% of it is military, probably would have been chosen. I think the military probably would have preferred Yarborough or somebody like Yarborough or somebody with Yarborough's background. Westmoreland had, however, a great deal of respect among civilian leaders. Far more popular and influential with the civilian leadership than with the military, and that's what counts because that's who appoints you. In fact, the Army, Earl Wheeler, who was the Chief of Staff and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Harold K. Johnson, who succeeded Wheeler, both, quote, swallowed hard when Westmoreland was appointed. They didn't want him either. This is their own branch, but they accepted it because, well, it's LBJ. What are you going to do? You can't tell them no, right? At the same time that Westmoreland goes to Vietnam as commander, Earl Wheeler becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Wheeler had virtually no military combat experience. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, Wheeler goes to Saigon, gets off the plane at, I guess it would have been Tan Son Nhut, and the VC Mortar, well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was there. People laugh. This is the first time Earl Wheeler has ever seen a shot fired in anger. Right? This is from military people. He was very slick politically. He was a manager, a bureaucrat, a political general, and really did not have any background to speak of in combat or anything like that. One military writer, Marine Colonel William Corson, who wrote a scathing indictment of the war in Vietnam, called Wheeler the Army's highest-ranking sycophant. This is how some people in the military think of him. And they said Wheeler gets promoted simply because, you know, essentially he kisses butt. He agrees with all his superiors and, you know, takes those interests and puts those interests ahead of those of his own service. Wheeler, however, had developed a strong relationship with McNamara. And McNamara sensed that Wheeler would be willing to serve as a broker between the military and the Pentagon rather than as an advocate for the military. Again, he's a manager, not a fighter, and this is what McNamara wants. He believes that he can have harmony with the military because of Wheeler. And of course, the military hates McNamara and will hate him even more. A lot of officers don't like Wheeler, don't like Westmoreland. It's not a popular team among the military establishment then in Vietnam. Okay, so this is the situation then at 64. Johnson is kind of having it both ways. The situation on the ground in Vietnam is not good. It's deteriorating. And the group that the Americans have put together to fight in Vietnam is not terribly popular. You know, you can kind of see where this is headed. This is not a terribly sanguine view. It's not terribly promising. This then is the prelude to some of the greater more important incidents that will eventually lead to American involvement in the war. The first and best known of which, of course, is the Gulf of Tonkin. Let me see if, okay, yeah, I messed up. Some of these links I'll fix, but some of them aren't working right now because it's a long story, but I basically put documents in the wrong way. So if they don't work, it's a document. All right. This all comes to a head in August of 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, LBJ is running for office as the peace candidate. At the same time, you know, he's not going to let the communists win, but he doesn't want to get involved in a war. The United States has been taking actions which are, no other word to use, provocative. In December of 1963, LBJ had LBJ had authorized something called Op Plan 34A, which included something called DeSoto patrols. Op Plan stands for Operations Plan. 34A is just a number attached to it. Okay. Op Plan 34A involved the United States patrolling the waters of the DRVN, especially here in the Gulf of Tonkin, and conducting kind of sabotage and surveillance activities there. The U.S. would bring, for example, South Vietnamese soldiers and try to infiltrate them into the north where they would conduct surveillance. The U.S. puts listening devices, you know, in Vietnam. It goes up and down the coast of the north, conducting surveillance and does things like that. So 34A operations then constitute, what's the term, progressively escalating pressure on North Vietnam. And as you can see, I'm looking, oh, there we go. They are an attempt to conduct what the U.S. calls punitive and attritional operations. So these are covert operations. Okay, basically these are attempts at surveillance and sabotage, covert as opposed to overt operations. Covert operations is a term that's actually was quite popular, like in the 1980s. All right, so they're covert. Operations Plan 34. Part of Operations Plan 34 were DeSoto patrols, American vessels patrolling the coast of Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin. What happens next is the subject of huge controversy and a lot of paperwork. People have written reams of stuff about what happens in the Gulf of Tonkin in August of 1964. The most recent book on it, which is, for now, the final word, is written by a guy named Ed Moise, M-O-I-S-E. It's called, I think it's called Tonkin Gulf and the Escalation of the Vietnam War. And this is an incredibly intricate, detailed blow by blow. I mean, it's like covers 3 days and 400 pages, so you get, you know, a little bit, you know, it's very detailed. And what do we know? Well, there's two ways of looking at this. One is LBJ's way, and the other is what happened. In August of 1964, there were 2 American ships patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. One was called the Maddox, M-A-D-D-O-X, and the other was called the Turner Joy. So they're the USS Maddox and C. Turner Joy. C. Turner Joy was an admiral who helped negotiate the end of the Korean War. I don't know Maddox. I don't know where that name comes from. And these articles, these links are down, so I'll have to go in and fix those. So you have this is a photo of the Maddox, which is a destroyer which is designed to carry out electronic surveillance along the coastline in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is what it's doing throughout 1964. Okay, so let's say this is Tonkin, the Gulf. According to international law, area from your coastline to 12 miles out is your country's territorial water, right? Beyond that, international waters. But within that 12-mile area, you control access. And so if another country wants to come in to that for trade or whatever reasons, they have to have your permission to do so. There's no question that DeSoto patrols are clearly within this 12-mile range in the Gulf of Tonkin, and they're doing this repeatedly, and they're dropping surveillance and so forth. In August of 1964, August 2nd and August 4th, I believe to be precise, something happens or something doesn't happen. You have to be a little bit cryptic here. Reports come back on August 2nd from the Maddox and Turner Joy that North Vietnamese torpedo boats have fired upon them. They see something on radar. They assume that the enemy's torpedo boats have attacked, and they got to do something. They have been attacked by the North. This is the story. Now, LBJ initially kind of laughs it off. LBJ says those damn stupid soldiers were probably shooting at flying fish or something like that. He said, you know, for all I knew, the Navy was shooting whales out there. Okay? They're real dubious about what's going on here. All right? These 34A attacks, 34A operations, Johnson claims that the Maddox and Turner Joy are just on routine patrol. But in fact, these DeSoto patrols are clearly violating the 12-mile territorial limit, and they're conducting sabotage and espionage against the North. There's a campaign of increasing pressure on the North that's been going on. As I said, 34A operations, O-Plan 34A was authorized in December of '63. So by August then, this has been going on for 8 months. All right, and finally, something happens. So on August 2nd, the Maddox claims that it was attacked. On August 4th, the Pentagon claims that there's another attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. All right. Now, Johnson remains skeptical. They're shooting at whales, at flying fish, or whatnot. That night, August 4th, LBJ goes on TV, and he gives a message. You know, and he gives the same message to Congress. Next, different words, but essentially the same message the next day. Last night, this is his message to Congress, August 5th. On August 4th, the day of the alleged second attack, he had spoken on TV that night. Last night, I announced to the American people that the North Vietnamese regime had conducted further deliberate attacks against U.S. naval vessels operating in international waters, and I had therefore directed air action against gunboats and supporting facilities used in these hostile operations. The air action has now been carried out with substantial damage to the boats and facilities. 2 U.S. aircraft were lost in the action, the first American POWs, which I'll mention in a minute. He goes on, so forth. Our policy in Southeast Asia has been consistent and unchanged since 1954. I summarized it recently with 4 simple propositions. 1, America keeps her word. Here as elsewhere, we must and shall honor our commitments. What's that? America keeps her word. What's that concept? Credibility. I mean, this is number 1, right? This is the basis of our policy in Southeast Asia. Number 2, the issue of the future of Southeast Asia as a whole. A threat to any nation is a threat to all of us, the domino theory. Number 3, our purpose is peace. We have no military, political, or territorial ambitions in the area. 4, this is not just a simple jungle war, but a struggle for freedom on every front of human activity. Our military assistance and economic assistance to South Vietnam and Laos has the purpose of helping these countries repel aggression and strengthen their independence. Okay, in recent months, the action of the North Vietnamese have become steadily more threatening. This is while he's conducting Plan 34A sabotage, and he's claiming that the North Vietnamese has become steadily more threatening. This is as the number of American soldiers in country has gone up. All right? So Johnson goes on TV and announces that the United States has been the victim of an unprovoked attack from the North, from these torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. He authorizes immediate response. Politically, on August 7th, Johnson has William Fulbright shepherd through Congress a resolution giving him the authority to take action to retaliate for these North Vietnamese attacks. All right, this is a picture of Fulbright and Johnson. And they would become enemies very soon, but in 1964, Fulbright's still a team player, and he, as the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations chairman, takes responsibility for the debate over what will become known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is very short, and the first paragraph is really what's important. It says, resolved by the House and Senate, that the Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to, these are the 4 key words, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Congress approves and supports the right of the President to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression. Number 2, the U.S. regards as vital to the national interest in the world peace, security in Southeast Asia, so on and so forth. But that first part is very important here. Johnson has the authority now to take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack and to prevent further aggression. What can he do now? What kind of authority, what kind of power has Congress given him? Yeah. Johnson would later say the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was like grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. This is basically a blank check. Later on, there will be those who say Johnson never had the authority to go to war. The U.S. never declared war. But in fact, I mean, this is a fairly broad authorization. Take all necessary measures to, quote, prevent further aggression. That means you can take preemptive actions to prevent something from happening in the future. All right? Now, in about about 2-3 years down the road, Congress revisits the Gulf of Tonkin. And in fact, after Tet, repeals the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it's kind of funny because a lot of these congressmen can say, oh, we didn't know. Fulbright shepherded this thing through, in fact. Fulbright had supported it and had been a big advocate of it. It was virtually carte blanche. But even more than that, the vote in the House of Representatives in favor of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was 416-0. In the Senate, the vote in favor of the resolution was 88-2. The 2 people who voted against it were actually Democrats. One of them is this guy here, Senator Wayne Morse from Oregon. The other was a senator from Alaska named Ernest Gruening, or Graining, G-R-U-E-N-I-N-G, Ernest Gruening. All right? Morse and Gruening voted against it. The debate lasted not even 1 day. The debate took place on 1 day. In fact, Morse, who opposed the resolution and opposed action in Vietnam, had wanted to testify against the resolution Matthew Ridgway, James Gavin, David Shoup, and J. Lawton Collins. He wanted these ex-generals to come to Congress and testify against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Fulbright, who would later claim he was hoodwinked and tricked, refused to allow Morse time to bring in dissenters. He allowed no debate on this. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution then was overwhelmingly supported by LBJ and essentially becomes his political basis for waging war. There was never a declaration of war. I know you've read a piece by Harry Summers in The Reader, and one of Summers' major contentions is that the major flaw was that the U.S. never declared war. You know, a declaration of war would have mobilized the country and so on and so forth, and then everything would have been different, you know, like World War II. But in fact, you know, if you read the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, I mean, it's fairly clear-cut. Take all necessary measures. Congress has authorized the President to essentially do whatever he feels is necessary to prevent further aggression in Vietnam. I mean, it's not a declaration. It does not say we send the U.S. into war against. But clearly, there's no question he has broad political authorization to do whatever he feels is necessary to prevent aggression in Vietnam, whatever that means. Johnson, his immediate response is to begin air attacks above the 17th parallel, which there had been discussion of that prior to that time. Johnson and the military had been discussing air power against Hanoi. Basically, let's go to the root. Let's attack Hanoi. It's like in the 1980s, Al Haig, in order to get rid of the Sandinistas. You want to get rid of the government in Nicaragua. Haig wanted to attack Cuba. Well, sure, Cuba and Nicaragua, they're only a couple thousand miles apart. And this is essentially, I think, the same logic here. To end the war in the South, we need to attack Hanoi, which is, you know, several hundred miles away. All right? But finally, Johnson uses Tonkin as the provocation. All right? Now, there have been plans for air attacks on the north for some time, and essentially Tonkin becomes the justification for it. The most recent work by people like Ed Moise, especially, and others, indicate fairly conclusively that on August 2nd, there was absolutely no attack. The whole thing was contrived. And on August 4th, there was a DRVN torpedo boat in the area, but there's no real indication that it fired on an American ship. James Stockdale, who became famous, was in '92 as Perot's running mate, was actually the first American flyer to fly a reprisal mission, a bombing mission, after Tonkin. And Stockdale, to this day, swears nothing happened. There were no enemy ships in that area firing upon U.S. ships. There were DRVN torpedo ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, it was their territorial waters. They were allowed to be there. But Stockdale claims to this day that the Americans, there were no shots fired. That in fact there were all kinds of squirrely things going on. The radar wasn't as sophisticated as it would be later. There literally were schools of fish in the area, and no indication whatsoever that there actually were American attacks in that area. Nonetheless, Johnson uses this as his excuse to begin air war against the North. This will evolve into Operation Flaming Dart. And this will be 64 to early 65. And this is the first American air assault against Vietnam. Yeah.
Do we know enough about the provocation of the Spanish-American War to compare, was it the Maine incident to this incident? It sure seems like there's some parallels.
Yeah, the Maine, I mean, it was a boiler that blew up. It wasn't, the Spanish didn't blow it up. And in fact, the Army knew that immediately. But the media jumped in and blamed the Spanish when in fact everyone knew. The engineers from the beginning knew what had happened. So yeah, it's, I mean, in that sense, the media was more responsible. But yeah, it's clearly the same thing. You touch on, and in Vietnam, you'll see this time and again. To kind of get ahead, one of my favorite stories is in 1965, Mac George Bundy is in Pleiku, which is in the Central Highlands, not terribly far from Cambodian border, actually. And he's at a base there. And while Bundy is at that base, the VC attack. I'll tell you this again probably next class. And as a result of this attack at Pleiku, while Bundy is there, Johnson unleashes the next phase of the air war, which is Operation Rolling Thunder, and basically blames it on the VC for the attack at Pleiku. And Bundy later says, my favorite line, Pleikus are like streetcars. What's that mean? Pleikus are like streetcars. If you're waiting for a bus and you get there late, what do? You wait because another one's going to come along in 20 minutes, right? So Pleikus are like streetcars. Yeah, this is our justification for fighting in Operation Rolling Thunder, but we'd have found something else. And this is essentially, you know, the U.S. has these contingencies on board, and they're basically waiting for something to happen. And Tonkin's good enough. You know, something else would have come along. So, I mean, that's one reason, you know, I try not to embellish events, because quite often they, you know, something else could serve the same purpose. I mean, Tet's probably different. Tet's huge. Dien Bien Phu was big. You know, those are huge. But things like the Gulf of Tonkin and the escalation of the war, whether the attack occurred or not almost becomes secondary. I mean, the U.S. clearly was planning on doing something because, why? The situation in the South was so bad, it really has no choice. It has to take some kind of decisive action. Yeah.
But what Gulf of Tonkin did do is cut off debate the way it was done.
Oh, absolutely.
And I guess thinking back on it, the vote was 98-2 in the Senate. The vote was unanimous in the House.
416-0, yeah.
Right, and the Democrats controlled both the House. I don't remember exactly who the Speaker of the House was. McCormick, maybe, or
Rayburn was dead, I guess, so it would have been McCormick.
Yeah, it was somebody that was fairly powerful. But over really what was a 3-day period, it passed. So it means it didn't have any discussion.
Let alone debate. Was not. You know, you're right. Absolutely. I mean, you know, the second attack allegedly occurs on the 4th. Johnson goes on TV the night of the 4th, addresses Congress on the 5th. I wish I knew what days of the week this was. And then the vote's on the 7th. So you're right, within 72 hours, this whole thing unfolds. This leaves no time for debate. The New York Times and the Washington Post jump on the bandwagon, and they're fully behind it. You know, Morse and Gruening are the only dissenters. and they're just shut off. So you're right. I mean, no, it's in that sense it is important. It's a good. It's perfect in that regard because the U.S. becomes the victim of aggression. And, you know, no one talks about Op Plan 34A. No one talks that this is an ongoing thing. No one discusses the violation of territorial waters. Those things aren't really in play at all. At the same time, you know, there wasn't much debate on Vietnam otherwise. I mean, you know, Johnson saw political capital in attacking Goldwater as being nuts, but by and large, Americans, you know, they think what happened with the Buddhists was terrible, but the popular knowledge of Vietnam is still not great. But you're right. I mean, there's no debate on it, but I'm not sure, you know, even without Tonkin, there would have been. And the Tonkin cuts off the debate for a very short time because by early '65, you're having teach-ins and you're starting to see, you know, people like Hans Morgenthau and military officials and, you know, folks like that coming out against the war. But you're right. I mean, in that regard, I mean, the debate was a sham. It was a joke. And for Fulbright later to claim he was somehow hoodwinked is farcical because if you ever read the debates, I mean, Fulbright pushes it through. And Fulbright, you know, would say, well, we didn't mean to give Johnson all this power. But in fact, if you look at his testimony during the very brief debate, if you want to call it that, on Tonkin, Fulbright very clearly says this is what this means. And essentially, Fulbright says, yeah, it means the president can do whatever he wants. So in that regard, yeah, the later complaints were a sham. Okay, so the U.S., the first attack absolutely could not have, I mean, it's almost certain did not occur. Not likely the second one did, right? I guess I don't like to get bogged down in this too much because I think you start to deal with minutia, whether they attacked or not, and you lose sight of the much bigger picture, which is, you know, U.S. policy in Vietnam, deliberate provocation, the need to somehow find a way to justify intervention, to justify air power, and so forth. And clearly, Tonkin is very important in that regard. So the United States sees an opportunity there, and it responds, first through air power. And this leads, as I said before, to, remember Johnson in his speech says 2 American planes were shot down. This is the first American POW, ironically an African-American named Everett Alvarez. There's a documentary out this year, 1999, if this is ever shown for future generations. Say hello to you in the future. Talking across time. This is kind of a quantum mechanics live, right? There's a documentary out in '99 called Return with Honor, which is about American POWs in Vietnam. And Alvarez is featured prominently. He's interviewed today talking about his experiences and whatnot. First American POW taken in Vietnam. The second was James Stockdale. So there are 2 POWs that result from the reprisals of Tonkin, Stockdale and Everett Alvarez, and they're both POWs for nearly over 8 years in Vietnam. Okay, so there's a price to pay as well. So the military response is to first conduct air raids against the North. Right. At the same time, the U.S. begins to take over the war more fully, but with doubts, with continued caution. The Tonkin Gulf affair sets into motion the American takeover of the war in Vietnam. In August of 1964, LBJ says, some say we should withdraw from South Vietnam, that we have lost almost 200 lives there in the last 4 years, and we should come home. But the United States cannot and must not and will not turn aside and allow the freedom of a brave people to be handed over to communist tyranny. Very high-sounding principles based on democracy and liberty and freedom. Privately, Johnson says, now I got Hose Pecker in my pocket. I'm going to go up Hose Pecker 1 inch at a time. All right? He's personalizing it. This is what I wanted all along. Now I can bomb him. I can bomb that little guy back to the Stone Age. This is the way LBJ thinks. So, and he's very personal about this. I got Hose Pecker in my pocket. This is what I've been waiting for all this time. And now he has it. So the U.S. begins to take over the war. The U.S. the vote in Congress on the resolution, which is almost unanimous, and the air war convinces people that the U.S. mean business. All right? But there's a downside to that as well. One CIA report says a lot of the ARVN officers believe now, based on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and Flaming Dart, that the U.S. is fully committed to fighting in Vietnam, and that means more of the burden of the war will pass on to the Americans. The ARVN says, woohoo, the Americans are coming in, they've made a stand, they've drawn a line in the sand here, they're going to take over. Right? So the CIA speculates that the ARVN will do less now because Johnson has made such a strong statement in favor of action. And even ranking officials like Maxwell Taylor and William Westmoreland are reluctant to take over more of the war. And they're afraid that Tonkin and the air war, the U.S. air war then, will lead then to greater American involvement and eventually an American takeover, and they don't want that. So Westmoreland, even, who is known as a hawk, is very concerned that the response to the Gulf of Tonkin may have been too much. The U.S. may have gone too far, that American attacks against the North, the air war, could prompt the Chinese to increase aid to the Vietnamese or even intervene, that it would increase infiltration into the South to counter the American personnel there, and that the Viet Cong would take more action. Westmoreland even is afraid that the VC will continue attacking American bases and suggests that Marines come in to protect the bases. All right? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, figuring they're already in, asked Johnson to approve a list of 94 targets for air war. But what's the overriding concern here? Is it communism and the communist insurgency in the South? It's still credibility. The Joint Chiefs of Staff say, and this is important for the future, any air campaign will not necessarily provide decisive end results, but if we don't attack them through the air, the enemy will think it is, quote, a lack of resolve. Again, credibility comes into play. So the U.S. takes over the war, though it has doubts about the effectiveness of doing so because, as always, American credibility is on the line, and this is what LBJ faces in the first year as president as he approaches Vietnam. To be continued.